Sometimes you just have to release a big sigh. And that's where we are, releasing big sighs on a daily basis. It'll get better. It really will. Everything will get better. It has to. I don't know if it could get any worse. Shh. Today, Muse, I have an interesting topic to discuss with you. One that actually can be used with both of my crafts. Crafty crafts. Not crafty crafts. Not like scrapbooking and things like that. You know the crafts for which I am talking. Acting and writing. The two crafts for which I am known. We'll just say that. What I want to talk about today has been inspired by the recent work that I've done and the work that I am doing. I want to talk about derivative works and how to avoid the associated traps that come with doing derivative works. Now, a lot of people use the word derivative in a negative way, and I understand that, and it's often applied in such a fashion. But the thing is, just about everything is a derivative work. You could think of almost all romance stories as a derivative work from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. And I also apply, because I work with technology so much, I also immediately think of derivative being an operating system that was derived from another operating system. So anything that was derived from something else is a derivative. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. However, when you're working with derivatives, there are obvious traps. And one of those traps is very dangerous. Not like physical harm kind of dangerous, but it's dangerous. Because if you fall for this particular trap, what you're doing, instead of actually creating a derivative work, you're creating more of a copy of a work. And that's a completely different story. And so I thought, Muse, it would be interesting to talk about how to avoid that particular trap when working with derivative works. Now, obviously, as you well know, I am currently working with something that is derivative. My book, Dracula Theory, is a derivative of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And I make no bones about that. And it's even set in the same period. Now, I don't know about you, Muse. I don't know how it works with you and your fellow muses, whatever the plural is of muse. I have yet to figure that one out. I don't know if you talk to other muses, and if you guys share and exchange and discuss your idea. The idea is that you then depart upon your humans. And if so, do you hear an idea from a fellow muse and go, that could work for my guy or gal. But what do I do to make sure that I'm not just stealing an idea from another muse? Because that would be bad. And I can only imagine that a muse stealing from another muse would probably, the consequences would probably be far greater than they would be for a human stealing an idea from another human. Maybe, I don't know. The ramifications could be limitless, I suppose. So what do you do as a human? Maybe as a muse, I don't know. What do you do as a human to avoid creating a copy instead of a derivative? Well, a lot of these ideas come from, or not a lot, these ideas come from my work on the stage, and on top of which my work in the classroom, because this sort of thing happens to actors all the time, wherein, and it just recently happened to me with Cabaret, wherein you have an actor that has created what is often considered the definitive performance for a role. And you have to come at that same role and bring something fresh to it, so, and not copy what they did. And you can, like I did with Cabaret, you can, in certain ways, pay homage to them, but you don't want to copy them, because you copying a definitive work is going to obviously be a lesser copy. So what do? Well, the way I work, when I come across an idea for a story that I think would be fantastic, but I can't just copy it. It's the same thing I did with Frankenstein theory. What do I do to avoid making copies? Well, the first thing I do is, and this is partially because of my actor training, and both the ideas that I'm going to impart upon you really do come from actor training. And my primary actor training is Meisner. And the primary thing that I do when I come across a story that I want to write, make my own, is that I use my imagination. Sometimes I'll put myself into the shoes of the main character, and use my imagination and walk myself through the storyline, choosing different routes, choosing different solutions for problems. And that is not how I create the outline or the plot. That's how I discover what is unique from my perspective, from my vantage point about this plot, that I can then take and turn and twist the plot into something wholly unique. Take, for instance, the Reaper series. When I first imagined, I can't even think of what the original title, the first title is. When I first imagined the first book in that series, the idea that came to me wound up being similar to the idea for Death Takes a Holiday, the movie. I could just write that. I could just rewrite Death Takes a Holiday. That's cheap and cheating from my perspective. So what I did was I took some time and I thought about that character, the Reaper. I thought about the Reaper, and I sort of walked through his day. What would the Grim Reaper's day be like if I took his place? Now that takes a lot of imagination, which a good deal of the Meisner technique is based on. So I was using my imagination and kind of walking through the day, and my imagination led me to kind of the inciting incident for that book, which is Grim walks into a diner and orders a meal and sees a woman, that woman being X in the story, in my story. And that led to me going, oh wait, what happens if Grim falls in love with X? And that led me down a completely different path than Death Takes a Holiday. And then I had my story. But it was really important for me to inhabit that character and then use my imagination to kind of walk through that character's day. And yes, the character, given the character's circumstance and traits from who the Grim Reaper is, at the very beginning, I didn't just create Grim. I stepped into the Grim Reaper's shoes and his big old cloak and scythe and said, what would his day be like? And that's how I do it. The same thing I did with Frankenstein theory. I decided to step into the shoes of Victor Frankenstein and kind of put myself into that period and walk through a day. And one of the first things that happened while I was walking through that day was attending a concert of classical music. And that completely changed, in a very immediate way, changed the story of Frankenstein for me. And that little moment became crucial to the plot. And that's one way to do it. Now, another way to do it is, and this kind of ventures sort of towards Stanislavski. If I were to take the plot of Frankenstein or Dracula, whichever, and then I take experiences and pieces of me, of my life, events that have happened throughout my life, and apply them to the plot that I'm looking at. How would I then react? Given my history, given who I am, how would I react if I were placed into those scenarios? How would Jack react? And this is not using my imagination. I mean, it is using my imagination, but it's using actual pieces from my life and the things that make me who I am individually. So what would Jack do if he were put in that period and came up with the idea of reanimating dead flesh? What would I do? And from that, from what you get from considering how you as an individual would react in those scenarios, you can then take the plot of the work that you are deriving from and turn it into something completely different. Right? And yes, it can take some time. And with me, especially using kind of a Meisner-esque technique with using the imagination and kind of walking through the day and not applying my experiences in life, because that's not how I work as an actor. But just imagine walking through the day of a character. It becomes really easy to reinvent that plot. And most of the time you're just reinventing that plot because you're truly discovering who this character is. And when you discover who a character is from your vantage point, that character becomes completely different. If you sit down and you think of who Victor Frankenstein is, and you kind of put yourself in his shoes and walk through his day, you're going to get a really good idea of what you think he is like and what his day becomes. And when you apply your filters to it, it becomes unique. And the other way, this is a simpler way to approach this whole thing, is to take the plot of Frankenstein and then you pick apart the bits that, and this is not, well, with Frankenstein, I've talked about this before. When I wrote Frankenstein theory, my ultimate goal was to make the story of Frankenstein more immediate, all the while keeping it in the period. And the way that I did that was I decided to take the film and the book, put them together, and then add the twist that I discovered while walking through the day of Victor Frankenstein. Okay? But there were bits and pieces in that original story and I didn't think they didn't stand the test of time. Now, there's a real obvious one in the Dracula book. I'm going to talk about the movie, but the book. In the book, there's a character. And I can't remember the character's name, but every time that character is in a scene, he speaks with such a very thick dialect that it's almost impossible to understand him. So one of the first things I did was remove that character because it didn't really serve a purpose. And then all of a sudden I go, okay, wait a second. Who are the characters in this story that truly serve the purpose of moving the narrative forward? And then I was able to weed those characters out, or not weed them out, but very selectively pick those characters and say, okay, now I'm just going to pick a number. I have 5 characters that actually move the story forward. And to me, that's very, very important. Having a story constantly be moving forward and not taking these side trips that are tangential to the main plot, that don't serve to move the main plot forward. Yes, it's okay to take tangents that are somewhat related, but also move the plot forward. So I had that little handful of characters, and I said, these are all I need to make this happen. And then you look at the story and go, okay, what did they do in the original story to make it move forward? And then you're able to really start to narrow down the scope of the story. And as you narrow down the scope of a story, you can start seeing a new thread to pick out. Also, at the same time, that narrative becomes very efficient. And I'm all about efficient narratives, because if you don't have an efficient narrative, you're going to lose your audience. And you don't want to lose your audience, period. So that is a really outstanding way of being able to take a work, create a derivative work, and make it your own. It takes some work, especially at first when you really start to use these methods. And there are more methods out there. A very esoteric thing that I've done when trying to come up with take an original storyline that appeals to me and make it something unique is I'll write down what I think is the storyline, put on a piece of music, let that music really consume me, and then start playing with the narrative as I feel that music is communicating. Because music communicates so much more than what's on the surface. One of the tricks that I always tell people to do when they're suffering from writer's block, which I don't really believe in, but when a writer is having trouble coming up with something new, one of the things I'll tell them to do is take a piece of music with a really good bass line in it, put some headphones on, and listen to that piece of music, but concentrate only on the bass line, because our minds tend to not do that. Our minds, when we listen to music, tend to listen to the melody and the words, and everything else tends to be kind of secondary. So when your brain starts listening to the bass line, you trick it into thinking in different ways. And after doing that for a while, your brain will just start firing on different cylinders. So you can do that for a while, take a plot line and stare at it and go, oh my gosh, I can find something. There's something completely different here. It's almost like this matrixy kind of thing where the bits of the story just kind of raise off the page, and you can manipulate them and rework them into something wholly unique. Ultimately, in the end, what I'm saying is, is that there are ways to take an original storyline like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet that everybody has rewritten in countless ways. There are methods that you can take those original storylines and make them your own. It only takes a little bit of work and a little bit of thought and quite a bit of care, but you can do it. And those are my methods. And I'm sure that there are plenty more methods that other writers have come up with. And I apply those same methods to acting when I approach a character. How can I imagine? What can I imagine? What can my imagination add to this character that could be different than how someone else has performed it? Or what, if I'm using a different method, what from my life can I apply to this to make it something wholly different? But that's how I avoid the traps of working in derivatives. Derivatives aren't necessarily a bad thing. They're only bad when you're making copies. It's okay. I mean, seriously, there are only 7 original plots. We had man versus man, man versus nature, man versus machine, man against self. I can't remember. Man against Scooby-Doo. No, that's not one. I can't remember all of them right now off the top of my head. But when you think about that, you realize that, yes, we've all been kind of working in derivatives all along. We're just making them our own. So take the time, put forth the effort, and make those derivatives your own. The little work you have to put in at the beginning will be worth it. Trust me. Anyway, that's all I have to say today, Muse. It's been fun. It's been swell, but the swelling's gone. You're still awesome.